Hey everybody, Nick here again. So right now I'm going to go ahead and talk about descriptive writing just for a little bit. And so basically this has to do with the first essay assignment that we have in this class, which is a descriptive essay. And so I'm going to talk about some techniques that I think will be useful for that assignment, um, and uh, um, and kind of go from there. And I will talk a little bit about that assignment specifically too. Um, okay, so and things I'm looking for in that assignment. So first of all, one thing I just want to talk about. Oh, and there's a little exercise that there'll be you can do also that will go along with all of this, which it'll be posted as part of the module. So hopefully that exercise will be helpful for you also. But this is me kind of just explaining, I think, some of the things I think are important to note about descriptive writing. So one of the things I think that's important about descriptive writing is that uh, that it is um, oftentimes people, when they are writing and they want to describe things, they want to describe things abstractly, so that they'll describe someone as strange or bad or funny, and all three of those words are highly, highly abstract. They don't actually tell us anything very specific about the person. If you say the person is a weird person or a strange person, that doesn't really tell us anything. Like, well, what do you mean by that, right? Like there's a million different things you could mean by that. So, like, let's get specific. And I think that is getting specific is useful, because also one of the other things about abstract description is that it's evaluative too, and it's sort of judgmental. It sort of evaluates and passes judgment on the things you're describing, right? Potentially. And that's not always a good thing to do. It's often better to leave that in the hands of the readers. Like, hey, I'm just going to describe it to you and you can make up your own mind about it, that kind of thing. That like it's better to show something specifically. So instead of using these abstract evaluative sort of descriptors, instead we wanted to use as specific and concrete details, right? So how do you do that, right? So for example, like this is let's just use this as an example. If I'm talking about somebody who works at a store, right? And the person behind the counter, if I said that they were angry, the person seemed angry, you know. Well, you might wonder, well, what made. See, this is the key thing. It's not just to say they're angry, because again, that's abstract. It's more evaluative. I have decided they're angry, right? But maybe it's better to describe them and let the reader make up their own mind what's going on with the person, right? If I said the person's face was flushed and they were sweating and they were glaring at one of their coworkers, and they slammed things across the scanners, they were ringing them up, right? That tells you a lot more, right? Than if I just said, "Oh, that person is angry," So it allows you to sort of then fill in the blanks about what's going on, and it really empowers the reader to make those kind of judgments, right? Like if I so also it's more specific in the sense that it tells you what's going on. If they're glaring at their coworker in this really like intense way, you're like, what's going on there? Like, and I haven't like told you this person is angry at them, right? But that's a fair judgment. But I'm leaving that in the hands of the reader. The reader can sort of just make up their own minds. All I have to do as the writer is just describe what the person is doing, what they look like, and be specific about it. Talk about the sweat beating on their forehead, and and the way they glared, and maybe they gritted their teeth as they slammed things across. So again, I'm just adding more details as they slam things across the scanner or whatever like that. Like so all of those elements are things that inform my impression of them being angry, right? But see, that's an impression I get because of all of these specific details. So that's something I often tell my students to do, is you have an impression of something that you walk away with, right? That person is angry. Then what you want to do, though, is ask yourself this question: why did I think that person was angry? What specifically led me to think that? Then I want to go back and look at those details and record them. So, like, make notes about those details that basically are going to inform, like, my impression of the thing that I'm trying to describe. Okay. So, for example, if you, so you guys are supposed to be describing a place. So if I told you that the place you were describing, like if the impression you had of it was that it was very peaceful, right? That's, again, a more abstract kind of detail. It's not necessarily bad to say something like that, but if that's the only thing you're giving us, you're not giving us very much. In fact, it's better maybe not to even say that and just give us the details that led you to think or to feel like, or gave you the impression that it was peaceful. What about it made you think that? And so tracing your impressions back to the source details that gave you that impression is really, really useful, and is one of the best techniques to use when you're describing something. Okay. So, so whatever your impression is of the place, you want to take that impression, and then you want to trace back to, well, what made me think that it was like that, specifically, like, and I can get very, very particular about it, and that's fine. The other thing is that you don't want to completely overwhelm us with details either. You want to come up for air occasionally, and you do want to give us the information in bite-sized chunks, right? So, you might talk about one specific aspect of the thing and give us several details about that, then move on to something else, right? So that's maybe all part of your description of the place, but that come in these discrete chunks, right? So that we have not just like a wall of text, like a paragraph, that just goes on forever. We have small, decent sized paragraphs, that are, a quarter of a page, half a page in length, maybe a little longer than that, but that don't get too much longer than that, because we don't want to just go into too much detail about one specific thing. We want to, because we just don't want to overburden the reader, right? That said, though, it's good to go into great detail about something. That's fine. But in fact, that's what you're supposed to do. But what I'm saying is, maybe you want to limit that. There was an author I was reading, and he was talking about this. And he was talking about when he writes, he was talking about fiction writing, and he was talking about describing characters. And he always kind of went with a rule that said that if he was describing a person, he would give you like 3 details about that person, 3 really good details about that person, and then he would just move on, and that was good. Now, I'm not suggesting you do that for the whole piece. Obviously, you can't just do 3 details, because obviously that's not going to be enough, right? But like 3 details about one aspect of a place might be good, right? And then move on to something else that's another part of the place, right? So you have it broken up into these discrete chunks, right? You don't have to do the rule of 3 thing. He just found that as a useful technique, because like it was manageable, and what he was very conscious of was overburdening the reader with too much description and then alienating them right? That's what we just want to avoid, okay? Because I have had some students who have done this assignment and have just written like a wall of text describing this stuff. And while I do want a lot of concrete details in this and a lot of good sensory details, and don't just rely on your visual senses, or rely on your auditory senses, your, what things smell like, obviously probably not taste like, unless you're there and you're eating something that's part of the location you're at. That's fine, but anyway, so those are things to think about. Uh, okay, so that's the basic technique I would tell you to do. Concentrate on good specific details. So you might ask yourself, well, which details do I focus on? I would focus on the details that you find interesting, strange, or revealing about the location. Obviously, if there's basic information you have to give us about the location, then give it to us, okay? That's fine. Give us the basics, right? But then, once you've done that, then give us what's interesting, strange, or revealing about the place, because you want to make the place interesting for us. How do we do that? Well, Ezra Pound, this is what he called defamiliarization, right? You defamiliarize the reader from something that they might even be familiar with. So basically, another way he sort of described this was to make it strange. So you take even things that are mundane, right, or things that might be everyday things, but you look at them in a new way. You make them strange, and that gives them sort of a new life, right? Suddenly just describing it in a slightly unusual way might give you insight into the thing and something that you hadn't noticed before about it. So that's what. That's the ideal, right? That we're trying to attain here. Obviously, we may not be able to do that every time, but but that's something to strive for, is to that's the reason we often read fiction and things like that, or poetry, is so he was talking about poetry specifically, which is to defamiliarize us with the everyday, and so we can come back to the everyday and see new things in it, and it changes maybe our perspective even on our own lives. That's why we all are interested in stories, right? Interested in poetry, because we want new perspectives, new ways of seeing. And we feed on these kind of things, or I don't know. Maybe we want to reinforce things we already know. I don't know, but there's probably a lot of reasons why we want. This is something we need, right? But good description is something that can be surprising, even when we're talking about something that is mundane. So that's important to remember. Okay, so I talked about that stuff. Now, the other thing I just want to talk for a minute about is the essay assignment, and specifically what I want to just warn you about is don't go into too much detail. I'm sorry, not detail, but obviously you want to have a lot of good concrete details in the paper. That's the main thing you're supposed to be doing. What I would caution you about, though, is turning your paper into a narrative essay. Because while you were supposed to describe, the prompt asks you to describe a location, right? It doesn't ask you to describe a series of events. So, like, if you spend most of your paper talking about the drive down to the location that you were going to talk about, and then you talk about getting out of the car and like finding a parking space, and then getting out of the car and then walking to the place, and then and then eventually it becomes this whole narrative about what you did, or something like that, and then the description of the place gets sort of left by the wayside. Whereas really it should be about the place, right? It's okay to have some narrative elements in the paper, right? That's fine. But what the paper shouldn't be was, I did this, 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 and then I did that. And then it loses focus talking about the place altogether. Like, that's not what you want. What you want is to be focused on the place, okay? Just start talking about the place. Like that's totally fine. Just start us there. You don't need to have to get us there, right? There's no reason to do that. Um, unless that is an important part of the place. If that's a really essential element, then maybe the arrival is maybe important, right? But that's for you to decide, right? However, though, I would just be careful about doing that. Okay, make sure if you are going to do it, that you have a really good reason for doing it, right? Um, Obviously, when you're writing a paper, you should have a good reason for why you put things in there, right? If there's no good reason for something to be in the paper, then you might want to ask yourself why it's there, right? Obviously, if it's there because I told you to put it in there in the prompt, that's a pretty good reason, right? If I asked you to do something, obviously that's what you want to try to do. If that's part of what the assignment is. So just remember that also. Okay, so you're supposed to be describing a place. Now, also, what kind of a place? Like, can it be like, well, really, it could be any kind of place. I would also caution you, though, about picking something too big, right? That you're just not going to have, because you only have a few pages to talk about this. So I would not suggest that you end up, picking something gigantic. I have students regularly who be like, "Hey, I'm going to talk about Disneyland." That's a common one people will pick, and I have no problem with you picking Disneyland. But for example, one problem I think students run into at Disneyland as a description is they try to describe the whole park, right, in 2 or 3 pages, and they really can't do that in a lot of detail, right? But what you could do is describe some part of Disneyland, right, or some aspect of Disneyland. Literally, you could describe a fairly small location if you wanted within the park, right? And that would be, if you just wanted to, I'm going to just talk about, this one restaurant that's there or whatever, the Golden Horseshoe or something like that. You could just literally focus on one thing and then just leave it at that, um, but um, but who knows? Like that is entirely up to you guys. As far as the parameters of the assignment go, you get to set those parameters. What I'm just, as a suggestion, saying to you is don't pick something that's just so big that you're not going to be able to get enough. It's better to have more, a smaller scale or smaller scope and go into more detail about it rather than pick something big that you'll never be able to cover, right? The whole thing. So, just keep that in mind. Pick something manageable, right? That you think you can describe in a few pages in a decent amount of detail. And it could be, now the thing about it is, remember though, you want to do the noticing exercise where what was your impressions of the place, what gave you those impressions, and then specifically what were the details, right, that gave you those impressions, right, and then record those details, and record as many of those kinds of details as you possibly can, and then go through those and decide which ones you think are the ones you really want to use, which are the really interesting details you think are things that are going to be revealing to the reader, or the reader's going to find interesting. Okay. Obviously, it's good to give us like the basic information on places and things like that. That's fine. Um, and it's okay to put yourself in the paper as well. Like that's totally okay. It's okay to talk about your experience, and even okay to have short narrative elements in it, like, oh, this happened to me while I was there, that kind of thing. That's okay. What I just don't want is a whole giant, like the whole thing becomes a narrative, and then you just forget about the location, right? Like that's not what I'm interested in. So I've had students who are like, say they're going to write about like the baseball park that they used to play at, and then they end up talking about their team and all their friends and what they did over the summer and how much they love playing baseball or things like that. And then I'm going, well, wait a minute, you didn't talk about the baseball park hardly at all. Like, so be careful about that. That's just something to keep an eye on. Okay, so this is a description of a place. That is the key of the assignment. So, and it's seeing how well you can describe. Okay. All right, so I think that's enough detail about that. I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I will see you guys next time, and probably we'll get into the discussion of the readings. Okay? All right. Thanks, guys.